What if I told you that in the age of strict morality and supposed maternal devotion, when Victorian society preached the sanctity of childhood and the purity of the domestic sphere, ordinary mothers were systematically poisoning their babies? Not in secret, not in shame, but openly, lovingly, with products bought from the local chemist and recommended by neighbors, nurses, and sometimes even doctors themselves. The image we hold of Victorian motherhood is one of gentle nurturing, of women in crinolines singing lullabies in gaslit nurseries filled with wooden toys and moral instruction. We imagine an era of family values, where children were treasured and protected. But beneath this carefully constructed facade lay a darker reality, one where the cries of infants were silenced not by comfort, but by drops of a substance we now recognize as one of humanity's most dangerous drugs. They called it soothing syrup. Quietness medicine. Godfrey's cordial. Mother's friend. The bottles lined chemist shelves like soldiers, their labels adorned with cherubic babies and reassuring promises. Today we would call these products by a different name, liquid opium, marketed to mothers as essential childcare tools. This is not the story of a few isolated cases or criminal mothers. This is the story of an entire society that decided it was easier to drug a generation than to address the impossible pressures placed upon families by industrial capitalism. This is the history of the quietness, a chemical solution to the inconvenient reality of infant needs in a world that demanded adult productivity above all else. Chapter 1. The Fight of Victorian Luxury, a World of Illusions. To understand why mothers would spoon opium into their babies' mouths, we must first strip away the golden veneer of the Victorian age and confront the sensory reality of life in industrial Britain. Step into Manchester or London's East End in 1850, and the first assault is not visual but olfactory. The suffocating stench of burning coal mixed with the organic decay of open sewers and horse manure. The air itself is a physical weight, thick with soot that coats the throat and turns the midday sun into a pale, bruised coin behind gray smog. Listen to the soundscape of progress, the relentless clatter of iron wheels on cobblestones, the shrieking factory whistles that regulate human life like a metronome, the rhythmic pounding of steam engines that never sleep. This is the heartbeat of empire, but for those living within it, it creates a prison of noise, where silence becomes not just desirable, but desperately necessary for sanity. In this world, the Victorian ideal of separate spheres, where women presided over peaceful domestic havens, while men conquered the commercial world, collapsed under economic reality. For working-class families, survival required every able body to labor. A textile worker's wife might give birth on Tuesday and return to the factory floor by Thursday, bleeding and exhausted, terrified that absence meant replacement by the hundreds of desperate people waiting at the factory gates. But here lies the impossible paradox that would drive mothers to desperate measures. If she must work 14 hours amid the deafening roar of looms, who watches the baby? There were no daycare centers, no maternity leave, no social safety net. The Industrial Revolution had devoured the old agricultural system where families worked together, spitting them out into a new order where individual productivity trumped collective care. A crying infant was not merely an inconvenience, it was an existential threat to family survival. Picture Ellen, a housemaid of 19 in a grand London townhouse. She rises before dawn, her hands already cracked from lye and endless scrubbing. She must light fires, haul water, empty chamber pots, and remain invisible to her employers. But Ellen has a secret that could cost her position. A baby boy with dark eyes and persistent cough, hidden in a makeshift cradle behind the servants' stairs. Her employer tolerates the child's presence reluctantly. Many servants were dismissed the moment pregnancy showed. Ellen works in frantic bursts, listening constantly for cries that might drift upstairs and provoke complaints. When the baby begins to wail, thin, desperate gasps building to piercing screams, Ellen's heart hammers with panic. If the mistress hears, there will be questions, threats, perhaps dismissal. What Ellen possesses, hidden behind the teacups, is salvation in a small brown bottle, Godfrey's cordial, given to her by another servant with whispered assurance. Just a few drops. Helps them sleep. Helps you keep your place. The cordial is thick, bittersweet, with a dark herbal smell. To untrained eyes, it resembles any other medicine of the era. To trained eyes, if anyone bothered to look closely, it reveals its true nature: opium blended with treacle, spices, and sometimes alcohol. Enough to sedate. Enough to transform a crying infant into a silent one. Ellen lifts the spoon with trembling hands, not from effort but from an unnamed dread. She chooses between two dangers: the bottle in her hand or the unemployment that would doom them both. The drops glisten, then disappear into the baby's mouth. Within minutes, his cries soften, his clenched fists relax, his eyelids flutter closed. The house is safe again. Order restored. Quiet purchased. But shift the scene from individual desperation to systematic exploitation. In mill towns across England, baby farms emerged, unregulated childcare operations where working mothers left their infants. A typical minder might receive 20 or 30 babies at dawn. Crammed into a single airless room, the sensory chaos would be overwhelming. The cacophony of crying, the stench of soiled clothing, the visual nightmare of tiny bodies in various states of distress. How does one exhausted woman manage this human storm? She doesn't manage it, she medicates it. A spoonful of cordial for each crying child transforms the chaotic nursery into an eerie morgue-like silence. The babies don't sleep naturally. They drift in narcotic stupors, their pupils contracted to pinpoints, their breathing shallow, their bodies limp as dolls. The mothers, returning from brutal factory shifts, find their children peaceful and good. They don't realize that this unnatural quiet masks a slow-motion catastrophe. The opium suppresses hunger, so babies stop demanding food. It slows development, so milestones are missed. It creates physical dependence, so withdrawal brings agonizing symptoms that seem like illness, prompting more doses in a vicious cycle. Medical officers began noticing disturbing patterns. Districts with heavy patent medicine sales also showed catastrophic infant mortality rates. But the correlation remained officially invisible, buried beneath euphemistic death certificates, listing convulsions, debility, or failure to thrive, rather than the truth. Systematic narcotic poisoning of the nation's youngest citizens. The machinery of this tragedy was oiled by an unregulated patent medicine industry that understood its market perfectly. Manufacturers crafted advertising that spoke directly to maternal anxiety and guilt, promising that their syrups would not only quiet children, but actually benefit them. Some advertisements suggested that failing to use these products constituted neglect, that truly caring mothers would provide this necessary relief. What desperate parents didn't know was that they were creating tiny addicts whose withdrawal symptoms would be mistaken for illness, whose stunted development would be attributed to delicate constitution, and whose early deaths would be mourned as tragic but natural losses in an age of high. Infant mortality. As we prepare to descend deeper into this hidden world, consider this: the bottles of soothing syrup were not sold in shadowy back alleys, but displayed proudly on respectable shop counters, their labels featuring angelic babies and maternal testimonials. The poison was normalized, commercialized, and integrated so thoroughly into daily life that questioning it seemed almost unnatural. But who were the invisible hands that administered these doses? And what drove them to participate in this chemical quieting of an entire generation? Chapter 2. The Invisible World: Servants Behind the Curtain. The true architects of Victorian infant drugging were not the mothers we imagine, middle-class women in drawing rooms, but an army of invisible caregivers whose desperation made them accomplices in a tragedy they barely understood. These were the servants, the childminders, the factory workers' wives, who administered the daily doses that kept British society functioning smoothly while its youngest members slowly faded away. Walk through the back door of any Victorian establishment, past the polished facades and into the servants' quarters, and you enter a different sensory world. Stone floors that never lose their chill. Air thick with steam from kitchen ranges, heavy with the smell of boiled cabbage, coal dust, and the sharp tang of lye soap. Here, in corners and alcoves, makeshift cradles house the babies of working women, children who existed in the margins of respectable society. The patent medicine manufacturers understood this hidden market with ruthless precision. Godfrey's cordial, perhaps the most infamous preparation, contained approximately 1 grain of opium per fluid ounce, roughly 65 milligrams of morphine equivalent in every ounce of syrup. To put this in perspective, a modern therapeutic dose of morphine for an adult might be 10 to 15 milligrams. A single teaspoon of Godfrey's cordial could contain enough narcotic to sedate or kill a small infant. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, manufactured in America but widely distributed throughout the British Empire, was even more potent. Chemical analysis of surviving bottles reveals concentrations that would horrify modern pharmacologists. Yet these preparations were marketed with testimonials from grateful mothers and endorsements from figures of supposed authority, their advertisements masterpieces of emotional manipulation that promised relief from teething pain while delivering chemical dependency. The cost structure was deliberately calculated to target the desperate poor. A bottle of cordial might cost only a few pence, less than a loaf of bread, making it affordable even to families surviving on subsistence wages. This pricing strategy was not benevolent charity but cold commercial calculation. Manufacturers knew their primary market consisted of women who labored in textile mills, match factories, and laundries, women who could not afford to miss work and had no alternatives for childcare. Consider the daily routine in industrial districts like Birmingham or Manchester. A typical working mother rises at 4 in the morning, nurses her infant if lactation hasn't failed from malnutrition and exhaustion, then doses the child with syrup before departing for a 12 or 14-hour factory shift. The baby is left with an older sibling, perhaps a child of 6 or 7, or with a professional childminder who might be supervising a dozen infants in a single room. These childminders, often elderly women supplementing meager incomes or young girls barely past childhood themselves, relied heavily on patent medicines to maintain order. Contemporary reports describe these baby farms with horrified fascination: crowded, poorly ventilated rooms where infants lay in rows, stuporous and barely moving, their natural cries chemically suppressed. A room full of drugged babies was manageable. A room full of alert, demanding infants was chaos. The medical profession's response to this mass drugging was tragically slow and compromised. Many doctors prescribed opium regularly for adult ailments and saw nothing inherently dangerous about its pediatric use. The concept of addiction was poorly understood. The term itself didn't enter common usage until later in the century. What physicians recognized as habituation was often dismissed as moral weakness rather than medical pathology. And the idea that infants could become habituated seemed absurd to many practitioners. Furthermore, the line between medical practice and commercial enterprise was blurred. Some doctors had financial interest in patent medicines, recommending specific brands and sometimes receiving compensation from manufacturers. Others sold proprietary preparations directly from their offices. Professional ethics as we understand them today barely existed, and regulatory bodies like the British Medical Association lacked authority to police either the profession or the pharmaceutical industry. The first systematic investigations came not from medical authorities, but from social reformers and journalists documenting conditions in working-class neighborhoods. What they discovered was staggering. Chemists reported selling enormous quantities of soothing syrups, sometimes dozens of bottles daily in single neighborhoods. One chemist in Coventry calculated that his shop alone sold enough Godfrey's cordial weekly to provide every infant in the district with daily doses. When investigators questioned vendors about warning customers of dangers, responses were uniformly callous. It wasn't their responsibility to question how people used legal products, they claimed. Besides, refusing sales would simply drive customers to competitors. This attitude was endemic, commercial imperatives overrode moral qualms, and in a competitive market, ethical concerns were luxury few could afford. The evidence mounted throughout the 1850s and 1860s, but translating awareness into action proved extraordinarily difficult. Who would regulate this profitable industry? The prevailing philosophy of laissez-faire capitalism held that markets should self-regulate, and government interference in commerce was viewed with suspicion. Manufacturers wielded considerable political influence, hiring medical experts to testify to their products' safety and threatening legal action against critics. Newspapers, dependent on patent medicine advertising revenue, were reluctant to publish expos that might offend major advertisers. The same publications that carried sensational stories about opium dens in Chinatown ran full-page advertisements for infant cordials containing identical substances. Their editorial and commercial departments operating in willful blindness to the contradiction. Meanwhile, the human cost accumulated in silence. Babies who survived regular dosing often showed profound developmental delays, slow weight gain, missed milestones, compromised immune systems that made them vulnerable to the infectious diseases already ravaging urban populations. Some developed permanent neurological damage resulting in intellectual disabilities or seizure disorders. Others suffered chronic digestive problems that persisted throughout their shortened lives. The addiction itself created perhaps the cruelest cycle. Infants given opium regularly for weeks or months experienced withdrawal symptoms when doses were stopped. Inconsolable crying, tremors, vomiting, diarrhea, fever, seizures. Mothers, witnessing their children's apparent agony, naturally assumed illness and resumed dosing, not realizing the medicine itself was the problem. This cycle of dependence and withdrawal could continue for months or years, slowly destroying young nervous systems while appearing to provide relief. As we prepare to examine how this tragedy extended beyond working-class desperation into the supposedly refined world of the Victorian elite, remember that the servants and childminders who administered these daily doses were not monsters, but victims of a system that offered no alternatives. They were trapped between impossible demands: keep the children quiet or lose your livelihood, and given tools that seemed miraculous, but were actually instruments of slow destruction. The invisible world of Victorian childcare was built on a foundation of chemical restraint, and those who administered it were themselves restrained by poverty, ignorance, and a society that valued productivity over human welfare. But how did this same poison find its way into the nurseries of the wealthy, where different pressures created similar outcomes? Chapter 3: The Rituals of the Elite: How Etiquette Became a Prison. The myth persists that infant opium use was purely a vice of the desperate poor, a symptom of working-class ignorance and moral failure. Victorian society's elite promoted this narrative enthusiastically, writing scathing editorials about the degenerate habits of factory workers, while positioning themselves as guardians of proper childcare. But scratch beneath the surface of aristocratic nurseries, and you discover the same bottles, only served on silver trays and administered by uniformed nannies rather than desperate mothers. The pressure on upper-class Victorian mothers was different in nature, but equally crushing in effect. These women were prisoners of etiquette, their lives rigid performances of social ritual, morning calls, afternoon teas, elaborate dinner parties, seasonal balls. Their appearance had to be flawless, their households managed with military precision, their children produced as evidence of successful domestic management. A crying baby, a disruptive child, represented not merely inconvenience, but social failure. Proof that a woman had lost control of her designated sphere. The Victorian cult of domesticity had created an impossible standard Mothers were responsible for their children's moral and physical development, while simultaneously maintaining serene households, presenting pleasing appearances, managing complex servant hierarchies, and fulfilling extensive social obligations. They were expected to be simultaneously devoted and detached, nurturing and controlled, ever present and never overwhelmed. In wealthy homes, actual childcare fell to professional nannies, whose job security depended entirely on producing quiet, well-behaved charges who reflected their competence. The fundamental rule of upper-class households was simple. Children should be seen and not heard, and preferably not seen too often either. Parents might visit the nursery for perhaps an hour daily, the celebrated children's hour, during which little ones were expected to be clean, happy, and silent. A colicky infant, a teething toddler, a child who cried during important social functions could result in a nanny's immediate dismissal without references. A professional death sentence in an era when character recommendations determined employability. The pressure to maintain artificial tranquility was immense, and nannies, like their working-class counterparts, reached for chemical solutions. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup was not exclusively sold in slum chemist shops. It graced the shelves of Mayfair's finest apothecaries and was advertised in ladies' journals read by the aristocracy. The same preparations that stupefied babies in Manchester tenements also quieted infants in Belgravia townhouses. The nanny would dose children before parental visits, ensuring they appeared good and placid, and administer nighttime doses to guarantee her own rest. The key difference was nutritional, wealthy children were generally better fed, making physical wasting less immediately obvious. But the neurological damage was identical. Victorian diaries and letters described children who were mysteriously lethargic, pale, or prone to fits. We read accounts of toddlers who seemed strangely clumsy, who had difficulty learning speech, who appeared perpetually drowsy. Modern medical knowledge recognizes these as classic symptoms of chronic opioid exposure, but contemporary observers dismissed them as evidence of delicate constitution or refined sensibility. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. Wealthy Victorian mothers would sit in their parlors, reading pamphlets about the moral dangers of opium dens, while upstairs in their own nurseries, their children floated in morphine clouds administered by employees hired specifically to protect them. The same women who contributed to temperance societies and moral reform organizations were unknowing participants in the systematic drugging of their own offspring. This creates a picture of normalized drug dependence spanning all social classes, united by the common goal of chemical child management. The quietness was indeed the great equalizer. Regardless of birth circumstances, crying children were silenced through pharmaceutical intervention. The medical understanding of what was actually happening to these children reveals the true horror. An infant's physiology processes drugs differently than in adults. Liver enzymes responsible for metabolizing opioids are underdeveloped in newborns, meaning drugs remain in their systems longer at higher concentrations. The blood-brain barrier is more permeable, allowing greater central nervous system penetration. Additionally, infants have higher proportions of body water and lower fat percentages, affecting drug distribution and storage. These physiological differences meant that doses which might merely sedate adults could easily kill infants. But Victorian soothing syrups weren't even formulated with adult dosing in mind. They were often much stronger. The immediate effects were readily observable. Within 15 to 30 minutes of administration, crying babies became drowsy and quiet, their movements sluggish, eyes glassy with contracted pupils, breathing shallow and slow. They would slip into unnaturally deep sleep lasting many hours, during which they might be impossible to wake. To desperate caregivers, these effects seemed miraculous. The child appeared peaceful, no longer distressed. But the reality was far from peaceful. Respiratory systems were being suppressed, reducing oxygen to vital organs. Digestive systems slowed, causing constipation and poor nutrient absorption. Natural sleep-wake cycles were disrupted, preventing infants from waking to feed at appropriate intervals. With repeated doses, tiny bodies adapted to the drug's presence, requiring increasing amounts to achieve the same effects. Chronic exposure had devastating long-term consequences. Surviving babies often showed profound developmental delays, slow weight gain, missed milestones, compromised immune systems, permanent neurological damage. Some developed intellectual disabilities or seizure disorders. Others suffered chronic digestive problems persisting into adulthood. The addiction mechanism was perhaps most cruel. Infants given opium regularly for weeks or months experienced withdrawal when doses stopped, inconsolable crying, tremors, vomiting, diarrhea, fever, seizures. These babies appeared to be in agony, and indeed they were, their tiny bodies craving substances they never chose to consume. Caregivers, witnessing such distress, naturally assumed illness and resumed dosing, perpetuating cycles of dependence. Victorian death certificates, when analyzable, tell grim stories. Causes listed as convulsions, suffocation, overlaying, or simply debility often masked opium poisoning. Acute overdose symptoms, depressed breathing, inability to wake, eventual respiratory failure could easily be mistaken for other conditions, especially by coroners lacking medical training who might be reluctant to implicate grieving families. Some deaths were more clearly attributable to the syrups. Newspapers occasionally reported sensational cases, babies found dead after childminders administered excessive doses. Infants who died after mothers gave multiple doses seeking sleep. Cases where bottles left within reach led to accidental fatal consumption by older siblings. These incidents sparked brief public outcry, but were treated as isolated accidents rather than symptoms of systemic problems. Manufacturers, confronted with mounting evidence of harm, deployed predictable defenses. Deaths resulted from misuse, they claimed, from exceeding recommended doses or administering preparations to already weakened children. They correctly pointed out that opium itself wasn't inherently evil, but a legitimate medicine with therapeutic uses. The problem, they insisted, lay with careless or ignorant users, not their products. This argument proved effective because it shifted blame from industry to individual mothers, exploiting Victorian anxieties about maternal competence and class-based prejudices about working-class ignorance. But emerging science told a different story. There was no safe dose of opium for infants, no reliable way to prevent addiction or overdose when administering such powerful drugs to small, vulnerable organisms. As evidence accumulated and reform movements gained momentum, the question became not whether these practices were harmful, that was increasingly undeniable, but whether a society built on such foundations could summon the will to change them. The answer would require confronting not just individual tragedies, but the entire system that made chemical child management seem not only acceptable but necessary. Chapter 4. The Dark Side of Wealth, Power, Misery, and the Price of Comfort. By the 1860s, the accumulated weight of evidence had become impossible to ignore. Medical officers, social reformers, and investigative journalists began documenting what many had long suspected. Something was fundamentally wrong with how Britain was caring for its most vulnerable citizens. The quietness that had seemed like a blessing was revealing itself as a curse that had claimed an entire generation. The first systematic challenge came from an unexpected source: the temperance movement. Victorian Britain was gripped by a moral crusade against alcohol, led by religious reformers who identified drunkenness as the root of poverty, crime, and social decay. As temperance advocates investigated working-class life, they discovered that alcohol wasn't the only substance destroying families. The widespread use of opium, particularly among women and children, became a new focus of their activism. Temperance literature began featuring harrowing accounts of opium-addicted infants and the mothers who had unwittingly created their dependence. These narratives were often melodramatic and moralistic, but they reached audiences that medical journals never could. Working-class mothers attending temperance meetings heard speakers describe the dangers of soothing syrups in terms they could understand, while middle-class women involved in charitable work learned about the epidemic, and began to see it as worthy of their attention. The women's movement, emerging as a political force in late Victorian society, also took up the cause. Early feminists recognized that infant drugging was intimately connected to impossible demands placed on mothers, particularly working-class women who lacked support and alternatives. They argued for better working conditions, maternity leave, healthcare access, and education. While these broader goals would take decades to achieve, the focus on infant welfare created alliances between different reform movements and built political pressure for change. Medical opinion was simultaneously shifting. The British Medical Association, now more established and influential, began taking stronger stances against patent medicines. In 1893, the BA published a comprehensive report on secret remedies that exposed the contents and dangers of numerous popular preparations, including infant soothing syrups. The report received wide publicity and created scandal. Manufacturers threatened lawsuits, but the BMA maintained its position, lending medical credibility to reformers' arguments. Individual doctors contributed through writing and advocacy. Dr. William Monk's influential work on infant care explicitly warned against opium-based preparations. Dr. Thomas Bull, another prominent pediatrician, called them slow poisons and urged mothers to reject them entirely. These medical voices, amplified by press coverage and reform organizations, gradually changed public perception of what had once seemed harmless or beneficial. The press played a complex role in this transformation. Newspapers remained dependent on patent medicine advertising revenue, but as public sentiment shifted, some editors discovered they could sell more papers by exposing scandals than by protecting advertisers. Investigative journalists began writing expose on the patent medicine industry, revealing fortunes made from children's suffering. These articles featured interviews with bereaved mothers, descriptions of poisoned infants, and damning statistics about mortality rates in areas with high soothing syrup usage. One particularly effective tactic involved publicizing the wealth and lifestyles of patent medicine manufacturers. When the public learned that makers of Godfrey's cordial and Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup lived in mansions and sent their children to elite schools, all funded by pennies extracted from desperate poor mothers, moral outrage was palpable. This wasn't merely a public health issue, but one of exploitation and injustice. Legal cases also contributed to changing attitudes. Coroners became more willing to rule that infant deaths were caused by opium poisoning, and in some cases, childminders or mothers were prosecuted for manslaughter. These prosecutions were controversial. Many viewed them as unfair persecution of women who were themselves victims of an exploitative system, but they served to publicize dangers and establish legal precedent that administering these preparations to children could be considered criminal. The Pharmacy Act of 1868 represented Britain's first significant attempt to regulate poison sales, including opium. The act required anyone selling dangerous substances to be a qualified pharmacist or chemist and mandated proper labeling. Opium and its preparations were placed on restricted lists, meaning they could only be sold by licensed vendors who were supposed to maintain sales records. The act also required containers to be clearly labeled with poison and the seller's name. On paper, this seemed like a major victory for reformers. In practice, its impact was limited. The act contained numerous loopholes and exceptions. Patent medicines, if labeled with manufacturers' names and ingredient lists, were exempt from many restrictions. Enforcement was left to local authorities who often lacked resources or will to pursue violations. Many chemists continued selling soothing syrups to anyone who requested them, and poison labels, when they appeared at all, did little to deter desperate parents who saw no alternatives. Moreover, the act didn't address advertising and marketing. Manufacturers simply adapted their strategies, making claims slightly less explicit, while still implying their preparations were safe and necessary. Some reformulated products to reduce opium content, but others simply relabeled existing preparations without changing formulas. The market for infant soothing syrups remained robust throughout the 1870s and 1880s, though it gradually declined as awareness grew. The real transformation required multiple converging forces. The Sale of Food and Drugs Act of 1875 and subsequent amendments strengthened regulation and enforcement. The Pharmacy Act of 1908 further tightened restrictions. Public health campaigns educated mothers about dangers and promoted alternative infant soothing methods. Medical schools began teaching about addiction and drug safety. Social welfare improvements gradually reduced the desperate circumstances that had driven many mothers to seek chemical solutions. By the turn of the 20th century, the use of opium-based infant soothing syrups was in steep decline, though it hadn't disappeared entirely. Manufacturers either went out of business or reformulated products to remove or drastically reduce opium content. A new generation of parents, educated about the dangers, sought different approaches to childcare challenges. But the legacy endured in ways both visible and hidden. An entire generation of Victorian children had been exposed to opium in infancy, and long-term consequences rippled through families and communities. Some grew into adults with chronic health problems, developmental disabilities, or predispositions to addiction. The trauma of losing children to poisoning or discovering that one had inadvertently harmed one's own baby left psychological scars on mothers that were never acknowledged or addressed. The story of Victorian infant opium use serves as more than historical curiosity. It's a cautionary tale about the intersection of commerce, desperation, and inadequate regulation. It demonstrates how easily societies can normalize profoundly harmful practices when those practices serve powerful interests and seem to solve immediate problems for the powerless. It shows the importance of scientific knowledge, ethical medical practice, and robust public health infrastructure in protecting the vulnerable. The tale also raises uncomfortable questions about our own era. We look back at Victorian mothers dosing babies with opium and feel horror. But are we so different? We live in times of overprescribed medications, ADHD drugs given to young children, ongoing opioid crises devastating communities. We market infant products with dubious claims, pressure parents to meet impossible standards, structure economies forcing parents to choose between caring for children and earning livings. The specifics have changed, but underlying dynamics remain disturbingly familiar. The vulnerability of children, desperation of parents, profit motives of industry, slowness of regulation. Victorian mothers who gave their babies opium were not villains, but women trapped in circumstances beyond their control, doing what they believed necessary with available information and resources. They loved their children and wanted them to thrive. That they were misled, exploited, and left to bear guilt and grief of their children's suffering represents the true tragedy. The manufacturers who knowingly sold dangerous products, regulators who failed to act despite mounting evidence, and social and economic systems that created conditions making such desperate measures seem necessary. These were the real architects of the tragedy. The Victorian mothers were merely the final link in a chain of exploitation that stretched from opium fields in India to nurseries in Manchester, from corporate boardrooms to corner chemist shops. As we close this dark chapter of history, we face a question that echoes across decades. How do we protect society's most vulnerable members when doing so requires standing against powerful interests, challenging accepted practices, and admitting that what we thought was helping was actually harming? The Victorians eventually found their answer, but it came too late for countless infants who never had chances to grow up. Their silent suffering, their stolen futures, stand as testament to what happens when commerce triumphs over conscience and convenience over care. In remembering them, we honor not just the past, but commit ourselves to vigilance in the present, to questioning what we accept as normal, and prioritizing children's well-being above all other considerations. The lullaby that killed has finally fallen silent, but its echoes remind us that the price of progress is eternal attention to those who cannot speak for themselves. Was it wealth that defined the Victorian era, or was it the quiet misery beneath their opulent facades? Perhaps the answer lies not in choosing between these interpretations, but in recognizing how closely they were intertwined. How the empire's prosperity was built on a foundation that included the systematic silencing of its most vulnerable voices. The mothers who reached for those bottles weren't monsters. They were human beings caught in an inhuman system, making impossible choices with inadequate information. Their story asks us to examine our own systems, our own impossible choices, and our own willingness to sacrifice the vulnerable for the comfortable. The Victorian age of quietness is over, but the questions it raises about power, responsibility, and the true cost of progress remain as urgent today as they were in those dim, cold-choked nurseries of the past.